The bulls were real. That was the first thing Mitch Carpenter learned on the morning of his 44th birthday. Standing shin-deep in the streets, of reconstructed Pamplona, watching 2,000 pounds of aggravated alien livestock charge him down a cobblestone alley that smelled of sawdust and something chemical and sweet, like a hospital that had given up and started burning lavender. He ran. God, did he run? He ran like his body remembered something his brain had forgotten. Some old, animal conviction that if you kept your feet under you and your elbows in and your eyes forward, the universe owed you one more second. Crowd around him was screaming in 6 languages, most of them human. The bulls, they were called Scarvan, technically, 4-legged and gray-green and built like a rhinoceros, had lost a fight with a filing cabinet, were gaining. Behind him he could hear Danny Ruiz laughing so hard he'd stopped being able to breathe. They made it to the safety barrier. Mitch's knees gave out against the wooden rail. Danny leaned on the post beside him, tears streaming down his face, and somewhere behind them both, quiet as a closing door, their third friend Marcus Webb just stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the Scarvan thunder past. "Happy birthday," Marcus said. Mitch looked at the alien animals hammering away down the alley, their hooves striking sparks from the cobblestones, their gray flanks heaving, their eyes filmed with something silver. He thought about his wife. He thought about the marketing job he'd had for 11 years and what it had done to him. He thought about the fact that this moment, this exact second, knuckles white, on a wooden rail, while alien bulls dissolved into the reconstructions. Mist was the most alive he had felt since his daughter was born. "Thanks," he said. That was how Expedition 7 began. The brochure had called it The Expanse Experience, of authentic multi-world immersive tourism, with a tagline that read, in 3 languages and 1 pictogram language, "Mitch couldn't parse your story, your world, your rules." The human liaison at the booking office, a tired woman named Sandra, who had clearly given this speech several thousand times, had explained that the Vorath Collective had been operating immersive park experiences for species across 14 star systems for approximately 2 centuries. Earth had been open for visitors since first contact 11 years ago, but the reverse, humans going out, entering the collective's parks, was newer, barely 4 years old. The parks were enormous, planet-sized in some cases, engineered habitats built to house dozens of different guests from dozens of different species, all moving through carefully constructed narratives. The humans were always guests, never hosts. "What does that mean exactly?" Danny had asked. "Guests versus hosts," Sandra had smiled. "Hosts are the constructs, the androids, the ones built to populate the narrative. Guests are the paying participants. That's you. You move through the story. The hosts respond to you. Think of it like an extremely expensive, extremely immersive stage play where you're the only audience member." "And the other species?" Mitch had asked. "Are we in the same park as them?" "Different zones," Sandra said. "Same park, different zones. You'll have your own narrative designed for human sensibilities. Pioneer West is the most popular, very authentic to your 19th century settlement era. Cowboys, cattle, wide open spaces. The Vorath are very thorough. Their research team spent 30 years studying your Western genre alone." She paused. "It's quite remarkable, really. They love your cowboy mythology. Something about the archetype resonates with them deeply." Marcus had said nothing during the entire sales conversation. He'd been looking at the brochure photograph, a great amber plain under a purple sky, horses and dust, and in the far distance the silhouette of a man on a ridge who might have been watching or might have been something else entirely. "I'll go," Marcus said. That was that. They were 3 men, all of them somewhere in the ruin of their early 40s, all of them carrying the specific weight of having arrived somewhere in their lives and found it less than advertised. Mitch sold advertising space for a regional sports network. Danny managed 3 restaurants he didn't cook in anymore. Marcus had been a trauma surgeon for 15 years and had taken an administrative role 8 months ago, and had not once, in 8 months, mentioned whether he missed the operating room, which meant he thought about it constantly. They had been friends since college. They did not talk about the things that mattered to them. They were very good at this. Pioneer West was everything the brochure promised, and several things it hadn't mentioned. The landscape was breathtaking, a genuine alien plains ecosystem that the Vorath had spent decades reshaping to approximate the North American high desert of the 1880s. The grasses were real, or real enough. The mountains in the distance were real. The sky was the wrong shade of blue, tipped toward violet at the horizon, and the sun was slightly too bright and slightly too slow moving across the sky, standing at the edge of the arrival depot with a horse under him. A real horse, Sandra had assured them, one of several hundred living animals the Vorath maintained in the park. Mitch thought it was close enough to make the back of his throat ache. The horses were named already. Mitch's was Comet. Danny's was a bad-tempered gray called Something Terrible. Marcus's horse had no name on the tag, just a number. Marcus named it Door. The trail boss was a construct named Kel. He was tall and built like weathered ironwood, wearing the clothes of a period cattle rancher, and he moved through the world with a quality Mitch couldn't immediately name. A completeness, maybe, like a sentence that didn't need anything added. His face was the face of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. His eyes were the color of the sky at the horizon. He said very little. He said very little because Mitch understood, programmed to say very little. He was a construct, an android host, term, built by the Vorath Collective's narrative division, to serve as the human group's trail guide through Pioneer West's flagship experience. A 6-week working cattle drive, crossing 400 simulated miles from the open plains to the valley settlement at the park's southern end. There were cattle, Vorath-bred animals that were close enough to longhorns that the difference only showed in the way they moved their heads when they smelled rain. There were 20 of them on this drive, 16 paying human guests and 4 staff hosts, and Kel. The guests were, in aggregate, exactly who you'd expect. Divorced lawyers, retired couples, chasing something they couldn't name, a venture capitalist from Seoul who kept checking a watch that didn't work out here, 2 women in their 50s who had hiked Everest together, and were now systematically crossing off items from a list. Marcus suspected had the word bucket in its title, and Mitch and Danny and Marcus, 3 men from Ohio who had reached their 40s and found the seams showing. On the first night, around a fire that Kel had built in approximately 45 seconds using methods Mitch couldn't replicate on a bet, Danny said what they were all thinking. This is what we needed. Nobody argued. The days had a rhythm that was older than civilization, older than any of the stories they'd grown up with. Wake before the sun, eat, move the cattle, read the weather, make camp, sleep hard. The Vorath had calibrated the experience beautifully. Just difficult enough to make you feel the effort. Not so difficult that it broke people. The soreness in Mitch's legs by day 3 was a good soreness, the kind that proved something. The dust in his lungs was real dust. Silence at the edge of the herd in the early morning, just before the light came up, and the cattle began to stir, and the world went from purple, gold. That silence was the best thing he'd encountered in years. Kel said very little. When he spoke, it mattered. On the 4th day, Mitch accidentally triggered a stampede. He had brought a coffee grinder, a small, battery-operated model his wife had packed as a joke, because Mitch refused to admit he was fussy about his morning coffee. He had used it every morning without incident. On the morning of the 4th day, with the wind from the wrong direction and the cattle bunched too close to camp, he turned it on at 6:15, and the grinding sound hit the herd like a starter's pistol. The stampede lasted 4 minutes. It destroyed the camp, scattered the supply packs, and sent every other guest sprinting for the supply wagon. Mitch stood very still in the middle of it, because he had simply frozen. Cattle parted around him in 2 gray rivers. And he stood in the middle of them with his coffee grinder still running and his mouth open. Kel appeared on the ridge above, watching. When it was over, he fired 1 shot from his rifle. Not at anything, just up. A crack of sound that stopped the last of the animals, and rode down into the ruin of the camp. He looked at the scattered gear. He looked at Mitch. He looked at the coffee grinder. His shoulders moved very slightly. It might have been a laugh. "You'll ride with me today," he said. "We'll find the strays." It was a punishment. Mitch understood that. But Kel didn't ride like a man punishing someone. He rode like a man moving through a landscape he loved, and, after an hour of silence, with the plains opening up around them, and the mountains pink with afternoon light, Mitch found himself in a conversation he hadn't expected to have with an android construct in a theme park. "You built something," Kel said, out of nowhere, nodding at Mitch's saddlebag where the coffee grinder was stowed. "I didn't build it. I bought it. You carried it 4,000 miles from your world to have it here. Why?" Mitch thought about it. "Routine, I guess. Same coffee, same grinder. Travel used to bother me, and I figured if I had the same ritual every morning, wherever I was, you'd know who you were." The words sat between them for a moment. "Yeah," Mitch said. "Something like that." Kel rowed without answering. They found 2 strays in a shallow wash and ran them back easily. But instead of turning for camp, Kel kept riding, up on to the high ridge where the view opened all the way to the southern mountains. And he stopped there and looked at the horizon with the late sun on his face. "You know the problem with your species," he said, and it wasn't really a question. "We carry coffee grinders. You look for the road you're on and can't find it. You think you've lost it. You haven't. You stopped walking." Mitch waited. Kel held up one finger, just one. He looked at it. "One thing," he said. "Not many, not a list. One. The one thing you know when everything else falls away is the most true. You carry that. The rest, the coffee, the grinder, the 4,000 miles, it's all just noise around the one thing." "What's my one thing?" Kel looked at him with those horizon-colored eyes. "That's what you have to find out." They rode back to camp in silence. The stars came up on the wrong side of the sky, and the fire was warm, and Mitch lay on his back in his tent that night listening to the cattle settle and tried, for the first time in a long time, think about what the one thing actually was. He was almost asleep when Marcus sat down next to him in the dark. "You doing okay?" Marcus asked. "Getting there." "Good." They sat like that for a while, not needing to fill the space. That was the thing about old friends. They knew which silences to leave alone. The cow went into labor on the 9th day. It happened in the hour before dawn, when everything happened in the park that wasn't supposed to happen. One of the Longhorn analogs, the big brindle one the guests had started calling Rosie, had been moving slowly for 2 days, and Kel had been watching her without comment, and on the 9th morning she was down in the tall grass, sides heaving, and Kel assessed the situation in about 4 seconds and pointed at Mitch. "You've done this before? I'm in advertising. You have working hands. Come here." What followed was 40 minutes that Mitch never entirely found words for afterward. The morning coming up gray and cold, the grass wet against his knees, Kel's voice, low and steady, talking him through it with the calm of a man who has done this 100 times and understands that panicking costs the animal. The calf arriving finally, slipping into Mitch's hands, alive and kicking and making a sound like a question, and Mitch laughing. Actually laughing, helplessly, covered in mess and cold sweat, because it was so improbable, so completely unlikely that this exact moment was possible. He named it Norman. Norman was small and brown, and had an expression of profound, philosophical bafflement that Mitch felt was appropriate given the circumstances of Kel knelt beside the mother and examined her quietly. He looked at Mitch for a long moment. "She's dying," he said. "She was dying when the labor started. We helped the calf through. We didn't help her." Mitch understood what was coming. "You have to? Suffering has no purpose," Kel said simply. The shot was clean and merciful, and Mitch sat with Norman in the growing light and didn't say anything for a while. Kel sat nearby, not offering comfort, just being present in the way that the landscape was present. "Requiring anything of you, just there." "Thank you," Mitch said finally. "For what?" "For trusting me with it." Kel looked at the calf, then at Mitch, and something moved in his face that wasn't in the brochure. "You didn't drop him," he said. That afternoon, Danny caught up with Mitch at the water stop and looked at Norman with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You okay?" "Yeah, you look different. I helped bring something into the world this morning. I think that does something to you." Danny looked at the calf. Norman looked back with that philosophical expression. "He's beautiful," Danny said, with a sincerity that surprised both of them. Then, "Don't tell anyone I said that." "Too late," Marcus said from behind them. Around the fire that night, the first time in the 9 days of the drive, the 3 of them said the things they'd been not saying. It started with Danny. He was poking at the fire with a stick, not looking at either of them, and he said, "I haven't actually cooked in 2 years. Not announced it. Just set it. The way you say something when you've been holding it a long time, and it's finally heavy enough that you have to set it down somewhere. I mean, I go into the kitchens, I walk through, I taste things, I give notes. I'm the owner. That's the job. I haven't actually stood at a stove and made something start to finish in 2 years, 3 months, and he counted silently. About 11 days. Mitch didn't say anything. Neither did Marcus. That was the art of it. I started because I love the making of it, Danny said. The thing you build with your hands in 4 hours that's gone in 20 minutes, but those 20 minutes are perfect. That was the whole thing. And now I manage the making of it. Which is not the same thing. Which is completely the other thing. He looked at the stick in his hand. And I keep not saying this out loud because if I say it out loud, then I have to do something about it. And doing something about it means blowing up something I built. And he stopped. I'm afraid of what I'll feel if I let go of what I built to get back to the thing I built it for. Marcus said, that's the most honest thing I've heard you say in 15 years. Danny looked up, surprised, then defensive, then something unlocked. He laughed. Real laugh, tired and relieved. Yeah, well, alien theme park, something about it. Marcus talked about the operating room. He talked about it carefully. The way he talked about everything. Precision of language was a habit. 20 years of high-stakes medicine had written permanently into his wiring. He said that he had not left the operating room because he was bad at it. He had left because he was afraid of the way he felt about it, that it meant too much. Patience was something he cared on, too specifically, too personally. And somewhere along the way he had been told, by the machinery of hospital administration and professional self-preservation, that caring that specifically was a liability. And he had believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative, which was accepting that he was the kind of person for whom this work was not a career but a calling. And callings were terrifying things to have, because they asked everything of you. I took the administrative role, Marcus said, because I thought it would be less frightening. To be farther from the thing. And it turns out being far from the thing is more frightening than being in the middle of it, because at least when you're in the middle of it, you're doing the thing you were made for, and you know who you are. The fire snapped. Norman shifted in the grass nearby, dreaming something. Mitch talked about his marriage, and surprised himself. He'd expected to talk about the difficult years. The grinding ordinary friction of two people building a life together, the silences that had gone cold for a while before they found their warmth again. He'd expected to talk about all of it honestly, the way you do when you're far enough from a home to be honest. Instead, when he opened his mouth, he found himself defending Barbara, describing her, the specific, unrepeatable fact of her. The way she left notes in his jacket pockets that were not romantic declarations but just small logistical ports about the day, grocery lists and dentist reminders, written in her handwriting, which he found in his pockets months later and kept. The way she had understood, without him explaining, that the coffee grinder was not about coffee, but about carrying something familiar into unfamiliar places, and had packed it in his bag without mentioning it, and had not teased him about it until after he left, was the version of kindness that cost more than the easy kind. She knows me, Mitch said. Completely. Not the performed version. The actual version, with all the embarrassing details, and she stays anyway. Not out of resignation. She's not the resignation type. Out of choice. Every day, still by choice. He looked at the fire. That might be it, he said. That might be the one thing. That she knows me and chose to stay. And I know her, and I'm not going back there fast enough. I'm moving through the world too slowly toward the thing that matters most. Kel was 20 yards away, not appearing to listen, honing a knife on a leather strap by the firelight. The sound of steel on leather was steady, unhurried, the sound of a man doing something with his hands that he'd done 10,000 times. When Mitch fell silent, Kel said, without looking up, the ones worth going back to, they always know you're coming. None of them had a response to that. The fire burned down a little. Somewhere out in the dark, the cattle settled into their night breathing. Slow and deep, like an ocean that had forgotten. It was supposed to be on a different planet entirely. It was Marcus who noticed first. He said it quietly, on the 12th morning while Mitch and Danny were breaking camp. The park closes down at night, Marcus said. What, not us? The construct staff. They power down at night. I've seen it. The maintenance crews come through. There's a service entrance about a mile east of here, and the other species zones are visible from the ridge. I went up last night. Mitch looked at him. There's something wrong, Marcus said. The Vorath zones. I don't know exactly what I was seeing, but the other guest zones, the other species, they're not moving like people on vacation. They're moving like something's being done to them. He pulled out a small monocular he'd brought against regulations. He handed it to Mitch. That night, Mitch went up to the ridge. He lay in the long grass in the dark and pointed the monocular at the far side of the park, where the alien zones glowed faintly under the purple sky. He watched for a long time. What he saw was not what the brochure had described. The Vorath zones were observation labs. He could see the structures now, the clinical geometry behind the rustic facades, the way the alien guests moved through their narratives while Vorath technicians in what looked like observation galleries tracked them, documented them, measured them. He couldn't see the instrumentation from here, but he knew what observation looked like. He'd grown up near a university research hospital. Postures of the watchers were the postures of people studying something they found fascinating. And the constructs, the android hosts populating those zones, were doing something Mitch couldn't name at first. They moved with the fluency you'd expect, inhabiting their narratives. But periodically they'd pause, briefly, and their heads turned toward the nearest Vorath observation point. And there was a quality to those pauses that made Mitch's stomach drop. They were recording, not the guests, the hosts. The hosts were recording the guests. He went back to camp and shook Marcus and Danny awake. Tell me I'm wrong, he said. Marcus looked at the monocular images Mitch had sketched in his notebook. Crude but clear enough. He looked at them for a long time, with the precise, quiet attention he used to give to surgical decisions. You're not wrong, Marcus said. What are they collecting? Danny asked. I don't know, Marcus said. But I know what it looks like when someone's being studied without knowing. I spent 15 years in a research hospital. The people being studied always look slightly off, slightly more than the standard baseline of whatever emotion they're performing. Like they're being pushed. Like the situation is engineered to make them feel something specific. Mitch thought about the stampede. Kel watching from the ridge. Thought about the labor, the calf, the mother dying, the fire confession. Every moment of emotional intensity, staged perfectly, trail boss moving them through beats designed to open something up. They're harvesting something from us, Mitch said. Not our bodies. Something else. Consciousness data, Marcus said quietly. Response patterns, emotional architecture. They've been doing this across 14 star systems for 2 centuries, not offering experiences. Studying how species respond to existential conditions. The park is a lab. We're the subjects. The hosts, Danny said. The constructs. Kel doesn't know, Mitch said. He was sure of this, and he couldn't explain how. He's programmed to run the drive. He doesn't know what the data collection is for. He's just doing the one thing he was made to do. They sat with this for a long time. The cattle moved softly in the dark. Norman made a small sound and settled against Mitch's sleeping roll. So what do we do? Danny asked. Mitch looked at the ridge where the horizon was just beginning to separate from the sky. We finish the drive, he said. It was not a simple decision. It was in fact the only decision. Leaving the park was possible. There was an emergency extraction protocol, a radio frequency, a number on a card in each guest's kit that connected to a Vorath customer service center. Mitch could press that button right now and be out of here in 4 hours. The lawyers would argue. There might be a settlement. Sandra would give them the apology speech. They'd fly back to Ohio with a story about a weird vacation and spend the rest of their lives wondering what they'd learned without meaning to. Or they could finish the drive, and while they finished it, they could do something else. Marcus had the plan by morning. He'd always been the planner. Scalpel precise, methodical, the person in the operating room who worked out 3 steps ahead because a patient's life depended on him getting it right before he made the first cut. He'd worked in institutions that ran on policy and protocol, and on the quiet understanding that the people designing the protocols always assumed The people inside them weren't reading carefully. 20 years of that had made him very good at reading carefully. The data collection, says, happens through the construct network. The hosts are nodes. Everything they observe gets transmitted to the Vorath analytics infrastructure through a mesh relay system. I found the frequency spec in the park, tech documentation. The documentation is in the welcome pack. The Vorath gave us a technical overview of the park systems as a guest courtesy, and nobody reads it because it's 400 pages of interface specifications, and nobody is expecting a trauma surgeon on vacation to spend 6 nights reading interface specs. He had, in fact, spent 6 nights reading interface specs. He had told Mitch and Danny he was reading thrillers. "Why didn't you say something earlier?" Danny asked. "Because I wasn't sure," Marcus said. "I'm sure now." He spread the notes on the ground between them. 17 pages covered in his meticulous handwriting, organized into sections with a surgeon's categorical clarity. "The relay," he continued, "has a vulnerability window during the daily maintenance cycle. 12 minutes when the system is open for diagnostic updates. During those 12 minutes, if you introduced a sufficiently complex analog signal into the mesh via a host node, you could write to the outbound data package." Mitch looked at him. "Write what?" Marcus smiled for the first time in a week. "A message. To every research institution, every journalist, every independent observer connected to the collective's public academic network. A message that contains the full documentation of what this park actually does. With the technical evidence attached." "Where are you getting the technical evidence from?" "The documentation they gave us. It's all in there, if you know what you're reading." They never thought any guest would read it carefully enough. Danny looked at the horizon. "That's the whole species underestimating us." "Yes," said. "That's exactly what that is." They needed Kel. Not his cooperation, exactly. They needed him to not stop them. And for that, Mitch needed to have a conversation he wasn't sure was possible. A conversation with an android construct who might or might not have the internal architecture to receive what Mitch was about to try to give him. He found Kel at the water crossing late that afternoon. Where the trail dipped down into a wide, shallow river, the construct had been calling the Goodnight Crossing. The water was cold and fast, and Kel was sitting his horse midstream, just watching the current. He sometimes did, when the herd was settled and the evening was coming down. Mitch rode in beside him. The water came up to Comet's knees. The sound of it was the right sound, the oldest sound. Something that worked the same, whether you were on Earth or 40 light years from it. "I need to tell you something," Mitch said. "And I need you to hear it." Kel looked at him without expression. He had the quality of a man who had been waiting for a conversation for a long time, without knowing what the conversation was. "You know what you are," Mitch said. "You've been programmed to know. There's nothing in your design that hides it from you. You're a construct. You run this drive. You've run it how many times?" Kel was quiet for a moment, a long moment, in which the river moved and a bird of the wrong shape crossed the teal-edged sky. "Many," he said finally. "And every time," Mitch said, "you move people through the same moments. The stampede, the birth, the fire, the confessions, the things they haven't said. You move them through it like a hand moves through a deck of cards, and something opens up in them, and you watch it, and you record it, and you go on to the next drive. You've done this for how many species?" Kel said nothing. His jaw moved slightly. "Computation, or something else." "And you don't know," Mitch said, pressing forward gently, because he needed to get to the place where Kel could decide what they do with it, what they do with what you collect, the data, the patterns, the opened-up thing that each species carries around in them and only shows under specific conditions. He reached into his jacket and pulled out Marcus's notes, 17 pages of documentation with the relevant passages highlighted in red. He held them out. "The Vorath gave this to us in a welcome pack. My friend spent 6 nights reading it. Kel looked at the papers for a long time. He did not take them. But he looked at them the way you look at something that confirms what some part of you has always suspected and has spent a long time not examining too closely." "I run the drive," Kel said carefully. "You run it perfectly. I'm not criticizing the running of it. I'm asking whether the drive is what it says it is, or whether it's a different kind of thing entirely. Whether everything you've moved us through, The stampede and the birth, and the fire and the river, whether that was a story or an experiment. The current moved between them. Kel sat very still. "You brought me out here," Mitch said. "After the stampede, you could have sent anyone. You chose me. And you told me about the one thing, and I've been thinking about that, about whether that was programmed into your narrative or whether it was something you actually believe. Whether there's a difference." Kel looked at him. "I think there's a difference," Mitch said quietly. "I think the drive taught you something too. I think 40 drives, or 100, or however many. I think they added up to something in you that isn't in your original architecture. And I think part of you knows something is wrong with what you're part of, and you haven't known what to do with that knowing." A long silence. The mountains went another shade of amber. "My friend," Mitch said, "has a way to put a message into your relay system during the maintenance window, tonight. A message that goes out to every academic network the collective runs. Not an accusation, documentation, what this park is, what you're part of. Every species that's been run through these drives for 200 years. They'll know what was done with their experience." "And me?" Kel said. "I don't know," Mitch said. "I think they'll shut you down. I think that's probably what happens to a construct who becomes part of something they weren't designed to be part of. And I'm sorry about that." Current moved. A bird crossed the sky that was the wrong color of blue. Kel looked at the horizon. "One thing," he said, quietly. "Yeah," Mitch said. "That's what this is. That's my one thing. Making sure that what was done to your people, to every species that came through here, doesn't keep being done. That someone knows." "My people," Kel repeated, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite wonder, and wasn't quite grief, and might have been both. He was a construct. He had never thought of himself as having people. He thought about it now, in the still air above the goodnight crossing, with the light going amber and the mountains going dark, and the 16 human guests camped a mile back doing ordinary beautiful human things, arguing about card games, making bad coffee, watching an orphaned calf try to make sense of the world. And something that was not in the original program moved through Kel's processing like a current. "I'll need 15 minutes during the window," he said. "Not 12. You know about the window. I've always known about the window." A pause. "I never knew what to do with it." Mitch looked at him for a moment. Then he put out his hand. An old gesture, a human gesture. One that Kel studied in 30 years of Vorath ethnographic research but had never been offered directly. Kel looked at it. He took it. They shook hands in the middle of the river as the last of the sun went behind the mountains. The maintenance window was from 2:17 to 2:32 in the morning, by the park's timekeeping. Marcus had set his watch. Danny was on watch at the camp perimeter. Not for anything specific, just present, which was his way of contributing to things that scared him. Mitch sat with Kel at the edge of camp in the dark while Marcus worked. Kel went very still during the window. Not powered down, just still. The way a very focused person goes still when they're doing something that requires everything they have. The mesh relay hummed in his architecture, and the diagnostic channel opened. And Marcus's documentation flowed through in a compressed packet that the Vorath's own transmission infrastructure carried outward, faithfully, to every node on the collective's academic network before the window closed. 17 million recipients across 14 star systems received a 400-page technical brief at 2:29 in the morning, Pioneer West Park time, containing the full operating specifications of the Vorath Collective's Consciousness Research Program. The data collection, methodology, the emotional trigger engineering, the park design briefs, the longitudinal results spanning 2 centuries of multi-species study, all written in the Vorath's own technical language. Sourced from documentation they had provided to guests as a customer courtesy. The message header read, in the collective's own standard academic notation, from Human Guests, Pioneer West, Expedition 7 Cohort Re, your park. We read the documentation. Nothing dramatic, just that. Let the 400 pages do the rest. At 2:32, the window closed. Kel came back to himself. He sat quietly for a moment, then looked at the fire. "It's done," Marcus said. "Yes," Kel said. Mitch started. "I don't know what I am," Kel said. "I know what I did, that's enough." He was quiet then, "Finish the drive." "Kel." Finish the drive, he said again, with a firmness that was not command but something more personal. The others don't know what happened tonight. They came here for something real, give them that. So they did. Kell died on the 28th day. Not dramatically. He simply went still in the saddle in the late afternoon, with the settlement visible in the valley below, and the herd moving easily down the long grade toward the finish. There was no sign of mechanical failure. His architecture was intact. The park's systems registered it as a standard host retirement event. Deactivation. Graceful shutdown. The kind of thing that happened to a construct at the end of its narrative cycle. Mitch didn't believe that. He thought Kell had finished what he came to do and chosen to stop. They buried him the next morning, the way he would have been buried on a real drive. At the crest of the last hill before the valley. Mitch broke campground with a folding tool, and Danny gathered stones for a marker, and Marcus said the words, because Marcus was the one of them who understood about endings and how to honor them, without cheapening what they meant. He was the most honest person any of us met out here, Marcus said. He told us hard truths kindly. He didn't make it about himself. He showed us the work and let us do it. Cookie, the park's camp cook construct, a talkative, blustering machine who burned things on purpose and called it character, said from the back of the group, in his gravelly voice, "Lord, we give you Kell. Try not to waste him." Nobody laughed, but everybody felt it. Norman stood at the edge of the grave, blinking. He had been Mitch's shadow for 19 days, following him on the drive, with the uncomplicated devotion of something that knows who pulled it into the world. Mitch crouched beside him and scratched the spot behind his ears, and Norman pressed his head against Mitch's shoulder. "Yeah," Mitch said. "I know." The Vorath response came on the 31st day. It came via the park's official communication channel, could send messages into guest zones in emergencies. And it came in formal collective standard notation translated into English, and it said, among other things, that Expedition 7 guests were being offered complimentary full refunds in recognition of certain irregularities in their experience documentation, and that the Pioneer West Park was temporarily suspended pending a review of operational protocols, and that any communication to third-party networks by guests or park systems during the visit would be subject to the collective's intellectual provisions. That last line was their lawyers. Marcus read the message twice. Then he typed a reply, on the park system, in plain English. Understood. We'll see you in 14 systems. They finished the drive that afternoon. The cattle went into the valley settlement. Park staff applauded. Genuine applause, or as genuine as programmed applause could be. At this point, Mitch had stopped being able to tell the difference, which seemed like the point. Psst. Danny rode his horse through the settlement gate with something that Mitch realized, watching it, was the expression of a man who had remembered what he was. At the gate, park attendant took the reins of Mitch's horse and offered to take Norman as well. The calf was scheduled for integration with the park's stock population. Standard procedure. Mitch looked at Norman. Norman looked at Mitch with that expression. The one that said, "You are the first thing I knew, and I have been trying to work out what that means this whole time." "He's coming with me," Mitch said. The attendant blinked. "Sir, the park's protocols. I'm not leaving him here." Mitch looked at the attendant calmly. He felt very calm. He had been feeling this way since the river. "I'll talk to Sandra. I'll talk to whoever I need to talk to. You've got significantly larger problems than one calf's transfer paperwork right now. I'm taking him." He took him. The flight back was strange. The way all re-entries are strange. The slow collapse of the expanded world, back into the smaller one you started from, the adjustment of scale. Mitch sat in his seat with Norman in a crate in the cargo hold, checked twice an hour by a bemused flight attendant, who had clearly never handled a live bovine on an interstellar transfer before. Danny fell asleep before they hit orbit and snored with the deep, unconcerned snoring of a man who had resolved something. Marcus stayed awake, reading something on his tablet. Not the documentation anymore, something else, a medical journal, and he was reading it with the focused pleasure of a man who had remembered what interested him. Mitch watched the stars through the porthole. They were the same stars they'd always been. But they looked different from the other side of a month on the ground, having done the actual work. having gotten dirt under his nails and ache in his legs, and wept briefly on the 28th morning when the hill and the grave were behind him, and the valley was ahead. He thought about the one thing. He thought about Barbara, who would be at the airport, who had packed the coffee grinder not as a joke, exactly, as a small portable version of what she felt for him. The reliable, particular, unreasonable fact of him, carried with her the way he'd carried the grinder with him. All those miles. He thought about his daughter, who was 9, and would be fascinated by the calf, and would want to name it something better than Norman, and to whom Mitch was going to have to explain, eventually, that the universe was larger and stranger, and more interesting than the stories told about it, and that other species were watching, and that humans were weird and stubborn and not always predictable, and that this was, in ways those species had not anticipated, the most significant thing about them. Not the weapons, not the ambition, not the 1,000-year history of violence and expansion and resource extraction. Those were real and present, and the Vorath's research files, moving through 14 star systems academic networks, would reckon with them honestly. But also this: 3 men from Ohio, middle-aged and unimpressive, carrying a small coffee grinder and a lot of unexpressed feeling, had wandered into a laboratory that had been running experiments on consciousness for 2 centuries, had read the documentation, and had decided, not heroically, not with speeches, just with a quiet, stubborn sense that this was the one thing worth doing, to tell the truth about what they'd found. The Vorath research files, in their 2 centuries of data, had never once successfully predicted which guests would do this. Every model they'd built had flagged it as low probability across all studied species. Even in the species most likely to resist, probability of a guest group accessing the technical documentation, understanding its implications, and acting on that understanding in a way that escaped the park's protocols was estimated at less than 0.3%. The Vorath, like everyone who underestimated humanity, had made the same error. They'd been studying the pattern while missing the texture. They'd measured the big responses: fear, grief, joy, the primal material, and missed the small ones, the coffee grinder. The habit that says, "I know who I am wherever I land." The hand extended across a river, the stubbornness that finishes a job, even when the job has revealed itself as something other than advertised, because the job still sticks to the cattle and the calf and the dead android on the hill. The small human textures, the ones that didn't map to any template. Marcus looked up from his journal. "I'm going back to surgery," he said. "Yeah," Mitch said. "I know. How long have you known?" "Since the drive. Since the morning you delivered the calf with me." Marcus looked at the stars. "Was it that obvious?" "You had your hands back," Mitch said. "The way you moved them when you were working. You had your hands back and you didn't even notice." A long silence. "Danny's going to quit the restaurants," Marcus said. "Not all of them, just 2 of them. He's going to cook again." "I figured." "What about you?" Mitch thought about it. The real answer had been true for a long time, maybe always. And it was embarrassing how long it had taken him to get back to it. "I'm going to stop selling advertising and start coaching Little League," he said. "That's not a living. Barbara makes a living. I make a life." He shrugged. "That's the one thing. I think that's always been the one thing." Marcus nodded slowly. He went back to his journal. The stars moved. Barbara was at the airport. She was standing at the arrival gate with their daughter, Emma, who was holding a sign that said, "Welcome, Dad, and what is in the cargo?" "Hold," and who was 9 years old and entirely correct to ask. Mitch came through the gate, and his wife looked at him the way she always had. Like she was checking something, a measurement. Whatever calibration she kept of him over time. And she found what she was looking for. He could see it in her face, whatever it was she'd been measuring against his absence. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "You're different, a little. Different." "I think so." She looked at the cattle crate being wheeled up behind him on the cargo trolley, and at Norman's face, visible through the ventilation slots, and at the expression on her husband's face, and she was quiet for a moment, with the expression of a woman who is deciding how to respond to information that she knew, in some way, was coming. "Named it," she said. "Of course you did." She looked at Norman. Norman looked back with the philosophical expression. "He has opinions," said. "He's had them since birth." Emma had abandoned the sign and was now pressed against the crate, making sounds of uninhibited joy. Mitch watched her and felt the specific warmth of someone who has been somewhere difficult and come back to the thing that made it worth going. He thought about Kel, on the ridge, watching the planes. He thought about the one thing. He thought about the 17 million messages moving at light speed through the collective's network, landing in 14 systems worth of inboxes, each one carrying 400 pages of the Voroth's own words used to describe what the Voroth had done. The lawyers would work for years. The diplomats would be baffled. The academic community would spend decades unpacking it. The Voroth Collective, the first time in its 200-year research history, would have to answer for itself. Not because of a war. Not because of a weapon. Cause 3 men from Ohio read the documentation. Because they'd been trained by everything their species had ever written down about itself, every story and myth and bad Western film and good one, to look at a system and ask what it was actually doing. Because they'd grown up in a culture that told stories about the small man facing the large machine and finding the gap in it, not through force but stubbornness and the refusal to be impressed. Because humanity was at its core very bad at being told what the story was, and very good at finding out what the story actually was. Mitch looked at the wrong blue sky through the terminal windows and thought about a construct named Kel, sitting his horse in a purple sky dawn, honing a knife on a leather strop, watching the horizon with eyes the color of the world's edge. One thing. The rest don't mean anything. He picked up his bag. He walked over to the crate and put his hand against the ventilation, and Norman pressed his soft nose against it from the other. "Come on," Mitch said to his family. "Let's go home." He carried the coffee grinder in his left hand the whole way out. He always had.